Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay. Shoot.
Well, let me start.
Can you say the date and time?
It's the 14th of January. We're not quite 3 in the afternoon. We're here in the home of Dwayne Huebner with Dwayne and Joseph Kaiser at the council.
And a box of books. And 6 boxes of books.
And 6 boxes of books, which Dwayne is kindly shipping to my house in Washington State, and they might end up at the University of British Columbia in the archive that's being discussed as a possibility with Peter Bremett, the head of the department. And Joseph is thinking about creating a virtual archive. The books won't go in there, but there could be photographs or something, I suppose, the books that were important to you at the end. I guess it's probably not a fair assumption that you kept the books that were most valuable to you.
Yeah, I got rid of the stuff that I gradually weeded out slowly. When I left Teachers College, I gave away most probably of the curriculum stuff.
Did you give it to the library, or did you give it to students? Or?
I gave it to students, basically, yeah. And I kept the things both in philosophy and psychology and maybe other fields, or even some of the historical stuff, until we moved to Virginia, and then I got rid of some of that, and this is essentially just all the philosophical, sociological material.
And is it fair to conclude that those are the most precious for you?
Yeah, I would think so, yeah. And not all of it carefully read, but some of the carefully read stuff was in there, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I made a remark last night at dinner in passing, and then you didn't comment on it, so I wasn't asking you to comment on it, but I'm going to ask you now, maybe. And that was that in my imagination, I thought that moving to Yale and focusing on questions of religious education were in some way maybe a relief, not only from the political situation at TC and the absence of students, which you'd mentioned earlier, but I'm thinking about the nation at risk as you left before in 1983, but there's this intensifying kind of...
Yeah, I don't think I left because of that.
Yeah, it wasn't a feature at all.
No, it wasn't a feature. I would occasionally attend to national trends, but not very often, and I left essentially because I was tired of focusing in on the literature within the general field of education and curriculum.
But you never focused on it exclusively. You brought to it all of this philosophical...
Well, it's true that I never focused on it directly, but I was addressing what I thought was the difficulties and problems.
Yes.
So I was responding to what I saw as holes or inadequacies. And the reason that I was looking forward to going to Yale was the chance indeed to deepen my theological interest, I guess would be the best way to state that, in a climate where it would be listened to. Realizing once I got there that I was disappointed in that expectation, but that's...
On both counts?
No, basically because I was hoping to find students that were really turned into that level of thinking about education and not realizing that I was going to be dealing with people who had no experience with teaching or curriculum and they needed nuts and bolts kind of thing rather than reflection upon the nuts and bolts.
Right.
So that was the disappointment.
And at least from the essays that we've published in the Transcendent, it seems that kind of way of working, that is reading the literature of the field and then addressing problems that are evident to you, it was a way of working that you continued. There's a kind of...
Oh yeah, no, there's no question about that. I think I was motivated not completely by problems, but by my own curiosity about how to understand the educational process. And when understanding the educational process required the occasional or more frequent use of theological or God-type language, I knew that in the secular community that was limited, and therefore Yale was an opportunity to continue that exploration, that curiosity that I had, which again didn't totally pay out, but nevertheless that was the intent. And so I was looking forward to more discourse with other people about that.
So you didn't enjoy that discourse with other people, with students. How about with colleagues?
No, I had some of it with colleagues, not a great deal of it, but some of it, yeah. And part of that is the way institutions of higher ed and theology work. You know, they're indeed the compartmentalizations there that they are elsewhere. So yeah, when I needed, I talked to some historians and some theologians, gradually talked to Ellen, biblically and other ways. And,
yeah. Right.
And I enjoyed the kind of, I spent a lot of time in my first few years at Yale working on a committee on field education.
Really?
So it was a matter of how do you help students, in this case in theology and religion, deal with transposing or using their background in theology or whatever it was in practice, and how do you help people who are out in the field be responsive to that. So I was working with people in my first couple of years with a lot of work in pastoral work, some hermeneutics, some religious education. It was that translation that I was involved in.
The categories are different, but that's classical
Same problem.
education work.
Typically so, yeah.
Work.
And that's one of the reasons that I was invited to participate in that kind of work, yeah.
How was it for you?
It was very good, but it eventually fell out because of changes in the administration and changes in the economics of field education and the staffing of that. Yale could no longer afford devoting as much money to adjunct types, pastoral people out in the field and supervising, same as supervising student teachers. So it sort of fell by the wayside, and then I gradually tried to get, at least through talk, not necessarily with much success in action, tried to get people in the so-called foundational fields to become more responsible for the religious educational competencies of their students. And I worked, for instance, one of the things that I did was to, and it didn't work out necessarily, but it was an interesting try. I worked with Jim Dittis, who was a pastoral theologian primarily. He's the guy that brought psychology into theology back in the 40s and 50s, I think, and a New Testament scholar who was also a professor of homiletics, and we taught a course together. Trying to look at the relationship between pastoral theology and homiletics and education and religious education. And I did that same thing once with in Auburn Seminary, where I worked with Jim Dittis, not Jim Dittis, with Jim Forbes, who was the pastor of Riverside Church and on the faculty of Union Seminary, and also worked with us at Auburn. And Jim and I taught a course together on religious education and preaching. That was a 1 week sort of intensive course. So I'd played with that idea before, but it gave me more opportunity. It didn't necessarily work out at Yale for a variety of reasons. Some of them political, some of them that the course wasn't designed as carefully, and I think Jim and the other guy I mentioned forgot his name right now already, really weren't as committed to it so much as willing to go along with what I was pushing. But still the right idea.
So, for you, are there are certain resonances between homiletics and teaching? Between preaching and teaching?
Oh yeah, well there's no question about that.
It really changes how we think about teaching.
Well, I don't think it necessarily changes how you think about teaching. Again, the comment that I used to make there, and I still make, is that one of the reasons there were deficiencies in religious education in churches is that the preaching was so damn bad it didn't raise any questions. So it was a matter of making people conscious that one of the ways of instigating some educational interest was to preach in such a way that you know, not that many people do that, and not that I was able to convince the homileticians there to do it, but that was my theme in many ways. And yes, the way you lay out a sermon, and the way you, in a sense, invite them into the text or invite them into a theological argument is by the quality of your preaching. It would be the same kind of thing that a teacher would do at one level, not with the same skills or the same dimensions, but you know.
Why not with the same skill?
Well, because the preacher working with 100 or so people doesn't necessarily have to attend to the individual psychodynamic of a person. You're dealing more with a community context, with the ideology or the cultural Weltanschauung, so to speak. Whereas when you're teaching, you indeed have to deal more directly with individual consciousness and how it is shaped and how it determines interest and things of that kind. Yeah.
To go back to the beginning, do you remember why you chose elementary rather than?
Oh yeah, no, there's no problem in that at all. That's when I was, and I think I probably made that decision in my last few months in the Army, and it was indeed an intellectual response, not an emotional response. Although, as I look back upon it, I would wonder whether there might not have been some, personality factors operating there. I clearly said I needed to understand what was happening in schools to children and to people, and why I did not have a better education, or why my colleagues. And I said, if I'm going to understand education, the place to start is to understand at the very beginning, and therefore I'll become an elementary school teacher. That was an intellectual decision. After I was teaching and after I became aware of my own characterological, faults, it was a wise decision, because I'm not sure at that stage in my life I would have been any good at all with adolescents.
Why do you say that?
Yeah, well, because it took me a long time to develop, sort of skills. I was a pretty introverted guy. I was not necessarily active in the adolescent community when I was growing up.
Really?
I didn't participate too much in it. I participated in clubs rather than the dating, dancing scene, and so I'm sure I lacked the skills that would have been required.
Of empathy?
Yeah. So my decision was indeed an intellectual decision. How much of it was informed by something at a deeper level that I never knew about until much later. Yeah.
Well, my association there was thinking of the psychodynamic element of teaching that you reference in response to my question about the distinction and similarities between homiletics and teaching, and you were pointing out that in partly due to the smaller number of people who were present, that psychodynamic skills, I think, were used were relevant in a way they weren't for a preacher. And so I was wondering whether, flipping back to the beginning, whether teaching young children forced you in some way to emphasize that psychodynamic. Children are, as Ethan was.
Well, see, when I enrolled at Chicago, I think I mentioned this before, that I entered the elementary education program, and when I went to register, I saw this segment over here of people who were registering for human development specialization. Now, geez, I'll go over there and see if they'll admit me to human development. And of course, they didn't, because I had been admitted to the elementary ed. And so I don't think I was enough aware when I made those decisions about how to proceed. I just assumed that the way to begin was to begin working with elementary school age children. And then I did a lot of focusing in on human development and educational psychology at the
They're intersecting. I mean, they're intertwining concerns, right?
Oh yeah, no, there's no question about that.
Yeah.
And I think if I had started with trying to understand, adolescent psychology, that would have been a totally different phenomenon. And I think I became much more capable of dealing with Piaget and early childhood development because of the elementary education focus. And I think without that, I probably would never have really attended carefully to Piaget and other stuff of that kind.
There, in Piaget especially, there is this kind of genetic, almost internal genetic emphasis. That is a kind of developmental.
Oh yeah. Which I pointed out earlier is lacking because he misses the first 6 years, which are so absolutely crucial. And it was big.
I was thinking it also had something to do with his early work on mollusks. I'm not sure. But
With what?
Mollusks. Remember his earliest work?
Oh, that's
on
right.
mollusks.
Yeah, that's right.
Isn't very relational.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the 30 or so themes that I made note of when I reread the collection in preparation for the visit was relationships. It turns out you reference relationships in these essays maybe 15 different times, and that's a different way of, I think,
Well, that was
it's not necessarily different, but it houses the developmental issues in, in a more relational fashion, and it acknowledges, I think, although you don't focus on this so much, well, you do talk about influence in cases, and I have another question about that, but questions of authority and how learning is nested in not personal relationships, but relationships nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the issue of authority was dominant in the early years. I grant that later on it was. And clearly the first professional thing that I wrote for ASCD was on relationship,
Relationship of
a man's relationship to man, that miserable language, but it was, and that was clearly that clearly came out of Buber at that time in my life. But yeah, and my background at Wisconsin in social psychology, there was no question, but you're dealing with dynamics and relationships. And also my work at the University of Chicago with Herb Thielen was group process kind of thing, which was one manifestation of relationship and power and so on and so forth. Yeah.
In those early essays, if you can give me a minute, I'll find which particular one it is here. Actually, in curricular language classroom meetings, I think that's 66 or so. 66. You focus on the pedagogic relationship as a matter of influence, and it seems to me you're keen to expose that there's an intentionality to the influence, and that there's and I think it becomes maybe the genesis of a later interest in power more abstractly. I'm not sure.
Well, I think I rather quickly focus in on the power element in terms of influence and the relationship between the teacher and the student indeed being inherently one of power, and whether very frequently the teacher didn't recognize it, and that discipline then was a manifestation of that, as well as grading and so on and so forth.
How do you think about power and the hierarchical element of the teacher-student relationship playing into the concern for a relationship which was more dialogic and I-thou and more egalitarian? Well,
but there you're caught up, it seems to me, in the whole history of the educational phenomena. I'd have to go back and look at that. For one thing, I want to go back and look at Willard Waller at that point. And I don't remember him well enough, but he must have been dealing with.
Right.
He must have been dealing with that.
Yes, he must have been. Canonical text in the.
Yeah, a very important text on teaching. Was it the sociology of teaching? Yeah. Was it that the name of it? Yeah.
Right. I'm at a loss for words too, what to say else, but he comes under critique. Baker.
The moment you start dealing with issues of any kind of issue in terms of classroom control, grading, anything of this kind, you're indeed dealing with power. And the thing that I try to point to, and I don't know how successfully or where I did, is that there is indeed the struggle of power between the student and the teacher, the parent and the child. And usually the adult doesn't think of himself or herself as having power because it is seen as a job or as a parental role, and therefore the dimension of power is hidden, which would be true then of your philosopher friend who focuses so much on power. Yeah.
And it seems to me that as eager or as committed as you are to expose that element of the relationship, you're also determined, or I'm not quite sure what the right verb would be, but you also want to affirm that not necessarily that you can't transcend those circumstances, but somehow you can work within them in a way that honors new relationships of person to person.
Well, I think
conversation.
Yeah.
That's more open and spontaneous, and
Yeah.
so you're not shut down by these.
Oh no, I raised questions about the limits and how that influences the both limits and restricts the nature of conversation, and the awareness of how that interaction is indeed boundaried by political and maybe sometimes economic aspects there. Yeah.
But it seems to me the greater emphasis, and perhaps I'm reconstructing your approach, but it seems to me the greater emphasis is on the affirmation of the possibility of an encounter that happens nonetheless.
No, I would agree with that. I would agree with that, and I sort of hint to the sadness that doesn't happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, you do testify to that.
And I probably keep looking for ways of focusing upon real dialogue coming out, knowing that it's difficult and sometimes impossible given the political constraints or the institutional constraints. Yeah. That incidentally is best affirmed, I think, in that article that's not in that collection on the the implications of psychological thought for the curriculum. I think I really attend to that issue.
Well, that could be
that
could be at the front of the line in the next collection.
Yeah.
You think I'm thinking of a student who at some point will want to trace a kind of genealogy of your thought over the decades, and I'm wondering whether you yourself would, in retrospect, think about this determination to expose hierarchy and influence is your first actually word of choice. I'm wondering if influence then becomes power. And I'm thinking about there are a couple of articles with power in the title, and then there's poetry and power, and then there's the genetic Marxism piece.
Well, the place where that comes out is very early, and one of the very first essays,
Politics and Curriculum 64.
Yeah, it was.
Laswell, and you're reading political science.
That's right. That was the very first curriculum.
You're thinking macro rather than.
That's right. But that was the place where I introduced power to the education, in my own thinking.
That's right.
Power, which is then.
Apple got his.
Oh, I'm sure he did.
The idea from you.
Except Apple's father was a communist.
Well, I know he had a stream, of course, but
but in terms
the authorization to use these chemicals.
Oh no, I agree. There's no question that Apple took that particular line of my thought and really developed it as his, and rightfully so. I don't have any regrets about that.
I'm not complaining either. Here's the Politics Curriculum 62. All right. By the way,
that was 62.
That's 62, and there's another one in 64, but the first one.
The first one was 62. That was the very first curriculum conference that I think I was involved in.
Is that right?
And that's the one where I think Mackenzie sort of stole some of that substance and
Is that right?
made his own, without acknowledging my influence.
My goodness. Well, in future work, it seems there are many sort of themes that are continuous in your work, like politics, that are somewhat obscured by my introduction and by the title. And so I think there can be studies
I would agree with that.
of your work that.
Yeah, but I didn't find that book got in the way of that theme. It's true, the
Not
title,
deliberately.
no, yeah.
But I think more attention needs to be paid, since the political has remained such a powerful thematic.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that.
So would you say this early influence and early interest in influence develops into which is in the context of a pedagogical relationship, that I don't want to say morphs, but becomes then this more kind of interest in social structure and
that
was there simultaneously.
But that interest I would again trace back to my work with Hans Gerth. And because Hans Gerth, with his focus on the sociology of knowledge and the relationship between forms of social life, democracy and socialism, communism and so on and so forth, and the reading that we did with Simmel and a variety of other European sociologists at that time, that whole notion of power, including a little bit of Marx that I might have read at that time, all clearly was in that direction. So I don't think I was reaching beyond something. I was probably reaching back to something that I had been referred to and then further developed it. And I don't know how I picked up the Laswell. I think I began becoming aware of power, began then to check out power and found out the stuff on politics. That's probably how that happened. Rather than dealing with politics first and then recognizing power. As far as I recall, I think once I began working at the doctoral, postdoctoral level, I think I was probably always aware that the educational relationship has inherently political power dimensions in it that needed to be articulated.
And then for the sake of emphasis, let me say again then, or ask that, so it's not that influence becomes power, but rather in your graduate work in social psychology, you studied with Hans Gerth, who almost, it seems to me, had a critical theory.
Oh, he was part of the origins of that. You know,
that was always connected.
Oh yeah.
Character and social structure.
Oh yeah. When the character and social structure book came out, we were enthused by it. We were really excited. Those of us in the Department of Curriculum, those of us in the Department of Sociology, were really excited about it.
That clarifies that.
Yeah. And I don't think that C. Wright Mills' book came out while we were there, but it came out shortly after that.
Right, but he doesn't do the character part so much. He's social structure.
That's right. He deals more with the social aspects of it.
Economic inequality.
Yeah.
Well, there are, I think, is it 3 or 4 landmark pieces that come out that have a date of 62. The Art of Politics and Curriculum, The Art of Teaching, Knowledge and Instrument of Man, Knowledge and the Curriculum Classroom Action.
Now, are those labeled 62?
They're all labeled 62. I know that doesn't mean you all wrote them in 62, but it led to a question: what on earth was happening in 62? What a fecund period it was.
May I look at that for a minute?
They may have been written earlier years, and you may have just published them in 62.
No, those essays of 62 are all, I thought it was later than that. I thought it was 64, were all written at the time when I was taking my summer off in Martha's Vineyard.
Well,
those are all essays that come out of...
productive summer.
Yeah, well, that's when I went, you can have this back.
No, don't throw it.
That's when I said I was on the beach reading Shakespeare, Robert Frost, and the St. Vincent Millay.
But you weren't just reading.
Well, no, I wasn't reading anything in education at that time. I purposely took that summer off to see if I could develop some competencies writing. And I knew that the thing to do was not to bring in more curriculum literature, but to read stuff that dealt with language.
That's right.
And then I would read the poetry and the Shakespeare in the morning, go home and take a nap, and then in the afternoon I would try to write in the curriculum field. And I didn't pay any attention to the literature in the curriculum field. I was writing out of what I thought was desirable and possible. And I don't remember how I organized those essays in terms of sequence, but I remember trying to turn out quite a bit of stuff. And the following year then, I sent that stuff back to the office and my secretary transcribed it, and I had it available for the courses that I was teaching in elementary education.
Well, so you wrote, you did handwriting.
Yeah, it was all handwritten.
Handwriting, all right, especially transcribed. And do you remember those courses? Homiletics would have been quite a startling topic for elementary school teachers, I think.
I don't remember. I can't refer to that. I do remember laying them out and using those as those papers out as discussion points. Whether I laid them all out or not, I don't know. I imagine that I did, and I knew that many of them needed really serious work and were nothing but indicators of what should be done, but I never then bothered to expand them or edit or work on them.
Well, they don't need to.
Well, yeah, some of them do.
I
The teacher, the one on teaching as a vocation, or classroom action or something, it just barely points to things and doesn't really elaborate it at all.
Well, it's a great gift, the pointing.
Yeah, well, that's true. I don't regret having done it, but I sort of regret that I never read and followed through. But that again was my style. And those are the essays that Alice Mile that thought I should try to work on and publish as a book.
Oh, was that right?
I didn't realize that was 62. That's interesting.
Well, was that, because the summer.
I had the feeling that
How
was...
long was the summer? Was it a month, 2 months?
Oh, 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
I got there, I took the whole month of June because the season at Martha's Vineyard were split, into two halves of the summer, and I took the first half of the summer plus some earlier weeks in that.
You had a room or an apartment?
I had a small apartment because I had room. I had the interesting thing, the people who drove me, let me see how that worked. The people who drove me there, no, I forgot which way this goes. I had two sets of friends, one would go with me and the other pick me up. One of them was Ed Henderson, who had been a colleague of mine at the University of Wisconsin, focusing more directly on human development than on curricular aspects, but he was also part of the seminars with Jim and I and so on and so forth. He ended up at NYU teaching child development. So he either took me there with his family, so the family spent time in that apartment overnight and then went back. And the other two that either took me there or brought me back was Hank and Greta Dershemer, who were my doctoral students at that time. And we were very good friends, and I used to go out to their house frequently. Greta got her dissertation finished before Hank did, and it took a while to work Hank's through. In that relationship, they had 3 children, and one of them was drowned in the ponds in Long Island where they lived. And and I had close relationships with both of those families at that time. And I lost contact with both of them. Hank and Gret divorced when they moved out to California, and I can understand that.
It sounds like a very special period.
It was a really great time on the vineyard. I really enjoyed it.
It seems to me that you described it as developing the writing competencies, and I'm not questioning that language, but it seemed like in some way the Shakespeare and Millay really functioned as midwives for you.
That could be. I wouldn't argue that. I didn't necessarily see it at that time. I knew that I had to deal with those who use language carefully and precisely, and that was part of my...
And lyrically.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's why I chose poetry rather than something else. There's no question. I'm sure I had been reading stuff on poetry and language earlier. I would wonder whether the Limits of Language book, for instance, I might have picked up before then.
I don't belabor it, but I'm curious whether the first time around you described it, it seemed like it was a kind of pressure situation. You knew you had to get something.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't external pressure. It was indeed internal pressure, knowing that I did not write easily or well, and that I needed time to try to do that.
See, nobody looking at this collection would ever say that about you, and so it's so amazing to hear you say that you thought that way about your writing.
Yeah.
No one would say that you.
Yeah. Well.
So you obviously, they did their job. You were born.
Yeah. Well,
as a writer.
I'm aware that I write very tightly and very concisely, and I don't mess around, so to speak.
There's a lyrical quality in some of them.
And I wonder whether that lyrical quality is in those essays that I did at the beach, or whether the lyrical quality comes out of my speaking ability.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. Because the piece I would say is the most lyrical is that Poetry and Power, which was the speech.
Well, see, this is where I broke up yesterday in terms of explaining that, and I think I can repeat. You probably heard this story before. My first experiences at Teachers College teaching, not the only ones, but the main ones, was working with the other elementary school faculty members: Alice Mile, Leland Jacobs, Roma Gans, Emmy Sheehy, Ken Wan, and there would be 5 of us on a Saturday morning or on a Thursday evening for 3 hours. There would be one lecture, and there might be discussions. I had small group discussions, then a lecture, or it might be something else. And I remember I think it was the first time I lectured in that situation. The room was, there I go again. This is amazing. The room was so absolutely quiet that I was really shaken. And I remember leaving there and going over to Riverside Church and crying. And the reason for that is I was not aware that I had the gift of spoken language.
So there were tears of gratitude and wonder.
And this is part of then the religious dimension, which I didn't acknowledge and didn't necessarily want to acknowledge in terms of God language, but I was aware of, Jesus, indeed I had that gift, and I was not developed earlier. My scientific mind, my mathematical competencies, and here I have the language, a language or the gift of language in a speech situation.
And in some way, the experience of that and the acknowledgement of that was an acknowledgement of the otherness in you. It felt like...
That's clearly part of, again, I'm not sure I want to use the word religious, but that's clearly an awareness of the religious or mystical dimension of which I am a part. I am much more than I know I am. I am much more than I know my personality is. What else could I have been, or what else could I be? What else is within me? What else is within the student? What else is within you? And what kind of suffering do you have to go through in order to get rid of the stuff that blocks the emergence, hence the lure of the transcendent. I didn't use that kind of language, but that was clearly there. A thankfulness, in Heidegger's terms, it is the thinking, dinkin dankin relationship. To use speech without thankfulness is a mistake. To be thankful without thinking is a mistake. And if you speak truthfully, you must speak. I don't know why it messes me up. If you speak without an awareness of what was been given to you, without a thankfulness, and that's part of the problems within the curriculum field. People write with maybe thinking but without thanking, or they write in a thanking way without thinking, and those two are related clearly. And the articulation of that clearly comes out of Heidegger. The awareness of that comes out of those earlier experiences. Yeah. I don't know why that is so emotional for me.
Well, it's still powerful. It's a very powerful. Why wouldn't it be?
Well, but it wasn't earlier. It's interesting because I used to be able to talk about that easily.